did just want to ask, are there people in the room, show of hands, people in the room who are a bit worried about that China-United States relationship and what it might mean for Australia? I see a few hands. You know, if you're out there in the world today, I think you might find a lot more people who are concerned about that relationship. And why are they? Well, why they are has a lot to do, I think, in Australia today with the fact that Barack Obama gave a very muscular speech about US foreign policy in Canberra to the Australian Parliament last year, but everyone thought he was talking to China and talking pretty tough to China. So what did some Australians think about this? Paul Keating is never at a loss for a good word, and in a long interview he ended by saying, frankly, it's going to be very hard for senior Australian government ministers to appear in China anytime soon. Of course, Bob Carr, who became Australian Foreign Minister, in fact, went to China. Mr. Carr, though, came back from China a couple of weeks ago and said that he was told by the Chinese Foreign Minister the time for Cold War alliances has long since passed. A direct reference to Australia's relationship with the United States. That led the editorial page of The Age to say that those 2,500 additional Marines, US Marines you've heard about in Darwin, can only be seen in Beijing as a direct provocation from the US via Australia. So that leads, I think, a lot of people in Australia to ask the question, are we backing the wrong horse in the 21st century? Now, I'm not sure we're backing the wrong horse or the right horse, but what I wanted to do was to reflect on the most important interaction between the US and China in the recent past. Does anyone know who this guy is on the screen for you all? That's Chen Guangcheng, the blind human rights activist. Remember, there was this massively high-level diplomatic crisis, was it a crisis? I don't know, between the US and China. Mr. Chen escaped house arrest, entered the US embassy in Beijing just before US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was arriving in China. That was an opportunity for the United States to say human rights is everything and we will protect Mr. Chen's rights above all else. It was an opportunity for the Chinese government to say, listen, we don't like your values so much, but you must respect our values. Mr. Chen is a Chinese citizen. He must be returned to China, potentially to house arrest. That was a diplomatic crisis waiting to happen. But what happened here is that Mr. Chen ended up leading a life that probably many young people in this room would like to lead. He's gone to the New York University Law School to study law. Now, that might look like a win for the US. Tick one up for the US, one down for China. But in fact, it could have gone exactly the other way, because the US government allowed Mr. Chen to leave the US embassy in Beijing and walk out the door back into China, where the Chinese government could have rearrested him. But none of that happened. We have a feel-good story at the end, and the feel-good story basically says that even though the United States and China have fundamentally different worldviews, no one should sugarcoat that. They have fundamentally different worldviews, but they have even bigger incentives to turn down the temperature on their relationship, to ensure that incipient crises never spiral out of control. And that, I think, is the feel-good story from Mr. Chen. Maybe that's a less feel-good story on the screen. That's Tiananmen Square in 1989, when the Chinese government used tanks to put down student protests. George Bush the father was the US president at the time. He's a revered figure in China. Why is he a revered figure? He's a revered figure because, according to the Chinese, he didn't overreact to Tiananmen Square. What did George Bush the father do instead? What he did was to say that we shouldn't isolate China in response to Tiananmen Square. We should engage China. And above all, we should engage China economically. Now, was that a crass commercial consideration for George Bush? I don't think it was. I think what he was actually saying was, the best thing we can do for human rights in China is to engage with China so that China's economy develops, Chinese people have more interactions with people in the rest of the world, and down the road, sometime down the road, human rights will be more respected in China. So it wasn't a cynical move, it was a far-sighted move by Bush. So what's the parallel between 1989, Tiananmen Square, and how both sides dealt with Mr. Chen 10 days ago? The parallel is that even though the US and China do not see eye to eye on a lot of issues, they have massive incentives to ensure that their relationship doesn't spiral out of control. What's really going on, I believe, in US-China relations is economic interdependence trumping geopolitical tension. Contrast today with that Tiananmen Square photo in 1989. In 1989, the Soviet Union was about to implode. But at that time, the Soviet Union and the United States had essentially no economic relationship at all. Today, the United States and China have a massive economic relationship. Last year, US-China trade was approximately $500 billion US dollars. Chinese government held about $1.6 trillion in US debt. That's plus or minus $2 trillion. That's about twice the size of the entire Australian economy is just in US-China economic interactions. So when people tell you that US-China relations are potentially a second Cold War, just remember that US-Soviet Union, zero economic interactions. US-China, absolute codependence between the world's two largest economies. So that's the new world we're living in. But I think the other thing that Australians, and in fact people around the world, need to come to grips with, maybe sooner than you think, is that the Chinese economy is going to slow down. It's going to slow down a lot, and that's going to have a lot of consequences. But let me just go back to where we are today. Today, everyone sees the Chinese growth rate. It's going like this. Everyone also sees that the United States, after the global financial crisis, is at best flat. You know, global financial crisis was terrible for the American brand. China came through the crisis incredibly well. On my little graphic up here, that's the left side of the slide. What we're looking at is this monumental day in world history when China becomes the largest economy in the world. Some people think it'll happen as early as 2018, others think it might be a decade later, but it will happen. And that'll be an extraordinary day because it will be the exclamation mark on probably the greatest development miracle the world's ever seen. 30 years of 10% per year Chinese growth, liberating literally hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens out of poverty. But what we won't see on that day is that China is about to slow down. Now, I'm not going to tell you that's because of environment or because of problems in the government or anything else. I'm going to tell you that it's literally the flip side of what led China to grow soon is going to mean China will grow much less quickly. China grew because it was a young country with a lot of people entering the labour market who worked for very low wages. China, in the 2020s, will be the first country in history to be old before it's rich. It'll also be a country now with middle-class consumers, not low-wage producers. Contrast that with the US. Everyone thinks the US is yesterday's power. But what we probably don't remember is the US actually was a power that didn't have massive economic growth rates in the past 50 years. In fact, the US economic growth rate from World War II to the global financial crisis averaged about 3.5% per annum GDP growth. Today, the US is growing at more than 2%, even though everything bad that could happen in the global capitalist economy has happened. It's just not going to be very hard for the US to get back to where it historically has been. What are the big drivers of the US economy? The US remains the world's innovation engine. It also is the world's immigration magnet. An extraordinary statistic that I would never have believed unless I read it is that of all the people in the world who've migrated from the country where they were born to a country where they now live, 20% of the people in the world who've migrated have moved to the United States. The percentage of people in the world, in contrast, who've moved to China is something like 0.02 of 1%. The US is an innovative country that still draws innovative people. What does that mean for the future? It means, I think, that we're going to be living in what I might crassly call a G2 world. It's not going to be a China-dominant world. It's going to be a China and US world. It's not going to be a second Cold War. It's going to be a world in which the economic interactions between the two superpowers will be the biggest story. Happy snaps. I was in Beijing this week. This is on the side. Over to the right is the #1 shopping boulevard in Beijing. Today it has a big arc over it. It's an arc that at one end is selling Samsung iPhones and at the other end is selling iPhone 4Ss. Now, I happen to have my Apple phone. I was taking this shot with my Apple phone. I was struck by the fact that we had a Nike ad, we had the Golden Arches and Pizza Hut right on the main shopping street in Beijing. That's the world we live in today. You might think that Nike makes money out of sweatshops. You might think that Apple assembles phones in China. But what's going on today is that China is the market for Western products. It's no longer the low-wage assembler. It is a market, and that increases the economic ties between the US and China. What's it mean for Australia? Well, we sometimes think, I think maybe Paul Keating was worried that we were going back to the future, back to the Red Square in Moscow. I don't think that's where we're going. I think this is where we're going. This is a page I pulled from a corporate website yesterday. It's the Origin Energy, an Australian company's website. And what this slide does is describe what I think is Australia's position in the world economy today between the two superpowers. Origin Energy has a large coal seam gas project in Gladstone, west of Gladstone in Queensland. We can debate the environmental merits of coal seam gas, but what I want you to understand is that that coal seam gas that Origin is producing is not destined for the Australian market, it's destined for the Chinese market. You had to turn it from gas into liquefied natural gas. That's a massively expensive undertaking. ConocoPhillips, an American firm, provided the money and the know-how to do that. Why would Conoco make that massive investment in Australia? It had nothing to do with the Australian marketplace. It had to do with the fact that a Chinese state-owned enterprise, Sinopec, said, we will buy all the gas you can produce for the next 20 years. So when you think about US, China, and where Australia fits, don't worry so much about the Marines. Think more about the fact that Australia sits propitiously between the world's two economic engines, not only today, but probably for the next 40 or 50 years. Thank you very much.